All right, so we're going to approach the apple in a similar way to tick marks, which is the exercise you just completed. So you want to paint with short strokes. So 1 inch to 1.5 inches. I'd actually recommend painting even shorter because it's your focal point. So whenever you have something that's kind of smaller on the smaller side, and that's a focal, you might need to go smaller with your brush stroke. So no longer than 1.5 inches at the most. The next thing I'm going to tell you is it's important to paint from dark to light. So I'm looking at the apple first, and I'm going to the form shadow. The form shadow is a shadow that's on the actual apple. So we're painting with the idea in mind of wrapping our stroke around the form. Kind of picture a ball of yarn, the way those strings, those lines conform to the sphere, because that's essentially what an apple is. See there how I'm curving? You could also think about it in terms of kind of like a spiral, that it's curved to the left on the left side and curved to the right on the right side. This will help you to suggest volume, but so will value. So it's important to think of both. What I do is I mix colors and I hold up my palette knife to my reference photo, being careful not to get color onto the actual photograph itself, but I close one eye and match that way. That's what the tick mark exercise also did for you. It honed your color mixing skills. When you're doing the apple, it's important that you realize that it's not all red, that you have areas in shadow where it falls into crimson or even brown or kind of like this murky greenish color. Because that red apple, this one in particular, isn't always just red. There's some greens in there. You'll need some yellow ochre as well. So have a full palette. I would avoid black at all costs. Do not use ick green, make your own green when you're doing this, and keep telling yourself that you're wrapping that stroke around that form. You're curving it. So important that you do that. There's also the dark side, the form shadow side, and the light side. And it's important that you make them distinct, although it is a gradual transition. So on that light side, I'm really pushing the saturated values. You may have a different photo reference from me, so you may be looking at the apple where the shadow's on the right side. Same thing is true, it's just in reverse. So warm on one side and lighter on one side and darker on the other. Remember how I told you that it was important to assign your brushes certain roles, like I assign color groups to my brushes? That's important here too. So I have a brush that is only for shadows, and I have a brush that is for lights. On this, it's important that you use a size 4 brush or larger. I would really shy away from using a very skinny brush if you have one in your collection. There's no need, and it's going to take way too much time. You can kind of see here how I'm painting in those short little strokes, especially as I'm working my way in towards that highlight. Now when you get to that highlight, I want you to paint it like you're painting a swirl. Think of Van Gogh's Starry Night, how he has that moon and everything's kind of spiraling into that moon. That's how I want you to approach that highlight there. So you're really thinking of painting in a curl. And on that right side, which is the light side on my reference, there's a lot of warms. So I'm not using any desaturated colors, I'm using bright colors. So red, coral color, so like a red-orange plus white, and I'm putting more white in it as I go progressively to the right. There's also a light spot on the top of the apple just before you get to that indent. There's like an indent or a valley there where the stem would be. There's a light side there too. And I'm always comparing one value to another. That's called value relationships. That's a good skill to have too. We are going to be putting 2 coats of paint on this. The importance of putting at least 2 coats of paint on is so detrimental, because with a second coat, you can make your painting better. You can improve it. It also eliminates that whole transparency effect that you get with some of the acrylic paint. So when you first lay down acrylic paint, it can be incredibly transparent, especially with some colors more than others. So with the second coat, you make it look more solid, more opaque. And that's a good thing, because we're trying to paint with acrylics. We're not trying to replicate what watercolor would do. On your cast shadow, it's a good idea to start off darker right underneath the form and then lighten it as you move to the left. I also think it's a good idea to paint side to side horizontally so that you get the idea that the shadow is stretching. And again, cast shadows start off darkest underneath the object, and then as they move away, they get progressively lighter in what's called a gradient. So it's a subtle transition. Just like there's a gradient on the apple from the form shadow side into the mid-tone side into the light side. Gradient is a slow transition. Sometimes on a cast shadow, you'll have a sharp edge, but that's only on the outer edge of the cast shadow. All right, so I'm working on the foreground here, and I will tell you that if you want to change the background, I would give you permission to do that, as long as you're doing a gradient. Gradients are vital to a painter. A gradient is when, we talked about this before, but when one color smoothly shifts into another. And skies are a classic example of a gradient found in nature, especially if you think of like a sunset where it starts off as like a teal color and it might shift into an orange, to a yellow, or to a pink. So you could switch out the background that you're seeing here for a gradient, as long as you're still using short strokes. Here I'm trying to replicate the tabletop, and the tabletop is white, but nothing in art is actually white. So you always have to flavor it. I'm making my own form of gray by taking the three primary colors plus white. So blue, a dot of red, a dot of yellow, white. If it looks green, then I have to add more red or more blue to it. And you could just paint exactly the background that you see. That's okay too. But if you wanted to play with it, you could. I would ask that you have 3 values that you're transitioning through on your gradient if you opt to do a gradient instead. On a background, I typically go for a bigger brush, so I'm not messing around with a tiny 4 or a round brush at all. I'm going for the biggest brush I have, and I paint it a little bit looser. I'm painting mine that dark background that's similar to one of the apple references. The dark background's nice because it provides some contrast. That way the eye is aimed more towards the apple and is not distracted by the background. We're going to talk about hard edges and soft edges at some later points. I like to play around with my backgrounds because you have more freedom. So instead of just doing a single stroke that's all vertical, you can angle your strokes, and I'm doing some X patterning back there, and I'm carefully working around the apple, but I'm also not afraid to accidentally overlap into the apple. It's a mistake to avoid painting up to the edge of an object, and I know it's really scary because you're worried you're going to mess up the apple, but you just got to go for it. And so what if you paint over the edge of the apple? The nice thing about working in layers is it gives you an opportunity to go in there next time and adjust some things. The second layer is when I start to refine my painting. I'll work on things like transitions between one color to the next. I'll work on blurring an edge. I'll work on getting more color accuracy. So that's when more of the detail work occurs in that second layer. So be understanding and forgive yourself if you make some mistakes on that initial first layer of the apple.